My 17-year-old daughter spent 3 days cooking for 23 people. 3 days. And 10 minutes before everyone was supposed to walk through our door, my dad sent one text. "We've decided to celebrate at a restaurant. It's adults only. No apology. No explanation. Just a message that erased everything my daughter worked for. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't chase after them. 15 hours later, the door started shaking, and that was the moment everything in my family finally broke open. Before I tell you the full story, I want to know you're here with me. Just drop a simple hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes knowing someone is listening makes all the difference. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. And if you're new here, feel free to subscribe. Stories like mine aren't always easy to share, but knowing there's someone out there who actually cares, it helps more than you know. My name is Rhett Hale, and this is what happened to me, my daughter, and the night our family finally showed us who they really were. My name is Rhett Hale. I'm 30 years old, a single father living with my daughter Lyra in a small, quiet corner of Benton Harbor. Lyra was only 8 when her mother walked out and never looked back, leaving the two of us to figure out life on our own. Over the years, it became our rhythm, my workshop, her notebooks full of recipes, my wood shavings on the floor, her spices filling the air. There's nothing glamorous about our life, but it's ours, and it's honest. Most days I divide my time between the small woodworking shop I run behind our house and making sure Lyra has everything she needs to chase whatever dream she's building that week. I've always tried to raise her to think for herself, to get her hands dirty, to believe that effort matters more than applause. Maybe because it was something no one ever taught me. Inside my family, applause was reserved for one person, only my sister, Selena. To understand what came next, you have to understand the family I grew up in. My mother, Marjorie, has spent her entire life trying to make everything look perfect on the outside: holiday photos, outfits, events, all curated like a catalog. My father, Clifford, is the kind of man who believes life has a hierarchy and that he is permanently stationed near the top. And Selena, my older sister, has always been his pride, the daughter who could do no wrong no matter how little she actually did. Meanwhile, I was the child who existed quietly around the edges, expected to stay useful, mild, and unimportant. Lyra has always felt that distance too. Whenever we visited my parents, they treated her passion for cooking like a phase she'd outgrow, a distraction, a hobby that didn't deserve real attention. During family gatherings, she was usually told to help in the corner or brushed aside while they doted on my sister's kids. I watched it happen again and again, and each time I swallowed the same burn I'd felt as a child. I didn't want that legacy for her. So when Lyra came to me 3 days before my mother's 68th birthday and said she wanted to cook the entire birthday dinner by herself, 23 people, a full menu, everything, I froze for a second. Not because I doubted her ability, but because I knew exactly how my family could be. Still, when she looked at me and said, "I want to show them I can do it," something inside me shifted. It was the certainty in her eyes, the determination, the quiet hope she tried to hide. I told her yes. I told her I believed she could do it. And I told myself to keep my anxiety buried deep enough that she'd never sense it. Because if she was willing to give everything she had, then I had to be strong enough to stand behind her. Lyra sat at the kitchen table that night, drawing out a menu detailed enough to rival a professional chef's. 23 servings, budget calculations, ingredient lists, timing for each dish, even how she wanted the table set in the backyard overlooking the lake. I stood in the doorway of my workshop watching her scribble notes with her hair tied messily on top of her head, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, pride wrapped tightly around fear. As I watched her plan the celebration like it was the most important moment of her life, a familiar ache stirred in my chest. I had been that child once, eager, hopeful, wanting to be seen. And I knew exactly how devastating it felt when the people you wanted to impress most simply didn't care. That night, as the house settled into quiet, I lay awake with a feeling I couldn't shake. It felt like calm before a storm. And deep in that silence, I could feel an old memory pulling itself back to the surface, the memory of a promise I once made to myself, that if I ever had a child, I would never let them feel the kind of abandonment I did. I didn't know then how soon that promise would be tested. The next morning day, one of preparation, Lyra was up before sunrise. I heard her alarm at 5, followed by the soft shuffle of her footsteps and the clicking of her pen as she finalized her ingredient list. When I walked into the kitchen, she already had her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled up, and her notebook spread open like a battlefield map. She didn't say she was nervous, but I could see it in the tightness of her smile. I drove her to the farmer's market first, then the supermarket, then a little specialty store she loves across town. She picked ingredients with the same intensity some people reserve for making life-altering decisions. And each time she placed something in the cart, she'd glance up at me and ask almost casually, "Do you think Grandma will like this?" She tried to sound confident, but I could hear what was underneath the need for approval. She'd never admit out loud. Halfway through our shopping, we ran into a distant acquaintance of my mother's, a woman I recognized from old church events. She greeted me warmly, asked a few small questions, and then said something that made my stomach tighten. "So I heard the family's doing the birthday dinner at Lakeview Harbor Grill this year. Lovely place." I didn't react right away, just nodded politely. Maybe she heard wrong, I told myself. Maybe my parents had mentioned something unrelated. But the unease settled into my chest like a stone. I didn't want to ruin Lyra's mood, so I kept it to myself. When we got home, Lyra dove straight into prep work. Washing, chopping, measuring. The kitchen smelled like butter and rosemary, and she moved around the counters with a precision I'd only ever seen from adults who've trained for years. I leaned against the doorway, watching her hands work, and suddenly I was 10 years old again, hearing my father bark at me when I asked about woodworking. "That's not a real trade for a grown man." The words had followed me for decades. Looking at Lyra now, I saw the same hunger for a craft, the same desire to build something real. But unlike me, she wasn't shrinking herself to fit their expectations. She was trying to rise above them. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. "Make sure there's room for people to park." On the surface, it was harmless. But it didn't match what the woman earlier had said about a restaurant reservation. The contradiction sat uneasily in my mind. I didn't tell Lyra. I watched her move around the kitchen, tasting a sauce she was perfecting, eyes bright with purpose. I didn't want to plant fear where hope was finally growing. But beneath the sound of her whisk scraping a bowl, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. Something about this wasn't adding up. And as night settled over the house, the tension did too. I tried to shake it off, but deep inside I knew this was only the beginning of a problem I had spent my whole life trying to avoid. And the worst part was knowing exactly how much it could hurt her if my instincts were right. By the second morning, the house already smelled like citrus zest and roasted herbs. Lyra had barely slept, but she didn't slow down. She moved from station to station in the kitchen, testing sauces, adjusting seasonings, building the bases for the main dishes and desserts. I spent most of the morning installing a new set of shelves she'd asked for so she could keep ingredients within reach. Watching her work was like watching someone chase something they'd dreamed of their whole life, and I didn't have the heart to interrupt her rhythm. While she whisked a reduction on the stove, I stepped into the living room for a moment and opened Facebook out of habit. The first thing that appeared was a photo my mother had posted. She was trying on a new navy blue dress captioned with "Perfect for a special night by the lake." My chest tightened immediately. Not a single mention of a birthday dinner at my house. Not one word about the meal Lyra was pouring her soul into. I stared at the caption longer than I should have. My mother loved being vague and performative, but something about this felt pointed, almost rehearsed. I tried calling Selena, hoping for clarity, but she answered with the same breezy tone she always used when she wanted to stay out of responsibility. "Plans can change last minute," she said. "Just let things flow." Her voice felt wrong, too casual, too dismissive. She was hiding something. I knew that tone. I grew up around that tone. Still, I didn't tell Lyra. She didn't need fear added to the weight she was already carrying. By early afternoon, Lyra's hands had begun to shake from exhaustion, especially when she worked on the berry glaze for the duck. I told her we could take a break, that no dish was worth pushing herself to the point of collapse. But she shook her head, whispering, "If I don't give them everything, they'll never see me." Hearing that hurt more than anything else that day. I had felt that same desperation once. I had lived in it. As she worked, I found myself telling her pieces of my past I usually kept buried. About how when we were teenagers, my parents pressured me into giving up the small savings I had scraped together so Selena could pay for an out-of-state workshop she never even finished. About how every time I voiced discomfort, I was told to stop being difficult. About how silence was rewarded and resistance was punished. I didn't know why I told her then, maybe because watching her fight so hard for validation brought everything back. Later, Lyra stepped out to get more measuring cups from the garage, and my friend Jamie called. I answered quietly, walking out onto the porch so Lyra wouldn't hear. I told him about the Facebook post, about the strange things people had been saying, and about the feeling in my gut that something was off. Jamie didn't disagree. I said I didn't know if my family would show up at all. I thought I was whispering. But when I walked back inside, Lyra was stirring her sauce with an intensity that didn't match what she was doing. She had heard something. Maybe not everything, but enough. She didn't say a word. She didn't flinch. She just kept working as if pretending not to hear would make the fear go away. That evening she tasted the sauce again, adjusted the salt, and finally turned to me. Her voice was small, almost too controlled. "Dad, do you think they'll come?" I said yes. I said it without hesitation, without letting my voice crack, without letting the truth slip through. But inside I knew I couldn't promise her anything. And the weight of that lie pressed on my chest long after she went to bed. On the third morning, Lyra was awake before the sky even began to lighten. I found her in the kitchen under the dim yellow lights, breathing a little too fast, moving a little too urgently. She had been carrying the pressure quietly for days, and by now it had turned into something heavy enough to bend her posture. But she still smiled when I walked in, the kind of smile that said she needed this to work even if she wouldn't say it out loud. All day she cooked nonstop. The kitchen turned into a miniature restaurant. Every surface was covered with cooling racks, sauce bowls, roasting pans, neatly labeled trays. When she began constructing the 3-tiered cake, I stood by the counter and watched the steadiness of her hands. Each line of frosting was precise, each placement of edible flowers intentional. There was a longing in every detail, a quiet plea for someone to notice her beyond the role they'd boxed her into. Around mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from a distant aunt on my father's side. "Heard everyone's meeting at Lakeview Harbor tonight. What are you prepping?" I stared at the screen for several seconds that felt like minutes. That name again. The same restaurant mentioned by the acquaintance at the market. Another piece pointing at the same direction I didn't want to face. I deleted the message before Lyra could see it. She didn't need one more shadow hanging over her. By late afternoon, the weather was perfect, warm enough to be pleasant, breezy enough to carry the scent of the lake. Lyra arranged the long table outside, smoothing each napkin, adjusting flowers, and positioning menus she had printed the night before. A gust of wind swept through the yard, lifting a couple of the menus into the grass. She chased them with a laugh that sounded thinner than usual. The whole scene was beautiful, but behind it something darker was forming. I could feel it, even if I couldn't name it yet. 10 minutes before everyone was supposed to arrive, Lyra was placing the final touches on the salad. Her eyes were tired, but she looked hopeful in a way that almost broke me. I stood behind her, trying to gather the right words. I wanted to prepare her gently to cushion the blow if it came, but nothing felt right. My throat tightened every time I opened my mouth. Before I could speak, my phone buzzed again. A notification from the family group chat. I pulled it out slowly, knowing already, fearing. "We've decided to eat at Lakeview Harbor Grill tonight. It's adults only." I felt everything inside me drop at once. Every warning sign from the last 3 days settled into place. They had never planned to come. Not once. Lyra noticed the change in my expression. She set down the serving spoon and turned toward me. Her eyes searched mine, reading everything I was trying to hide, everything I had failed to stop. "Dad, what's going on?" The words came out soft, but they cut sharper than anything I'd heard in years. And in that moment, with the table set, the candles ready, the food warm and perfect, I knew the storm had finally arrived. I was standing in the backyard when the message lit up my screen. We've decided to eat at Lakeview Harbor Grill. It's adults only. For a moment, the sounds around me faded, the breeze coming off the lake, the rustling of the decorations Lyra had set up, even the hum of the kitchen fan behind me. All I could feel was the same familiar break in my chest, the one I'd carried since childhood, the one that hit every time my family made sure I understood my place. It happened again, just like that, in the span of a single text. My mind flooded with questions. Why didn't they say anything earlier? Why pretend the dinner was still happening? Why lie about adults only when Lyra had poured her heart into every dish? Why ignore everything she had done? And why did I still expect anything different from them? I tried to hide the message, tried to put my phone away. But Lyra caught the shift in my face immediately. She moved toward me, her brow furrowed with worry she didn't want to show. "Dad, what is it?" Before I could think of a way to soften the blow, she reached for my phone. I hesitated for a second, then she pulled it gently but firmly from my hand. She stared at the message. At first, she didn't react at all. She just stood there, silent, holding the phone like it weighed more than she could manage. Then her thumb slid up and she saw the photos, my parents, my sister, my nieces and nephews all smiling around a long dinner table at the restaurant. Plates already full. Glasses raised, kids included. Everything in those photos confirmed what the message didn't even bother to hide. They never intended to come. The silence that followed was worse than any screaming. Lyra walked into the living room and dialed my mother. I stayed by the doorway, listening to the way her voice shrank with every second. I heard the soft responses, the tiny forced nods, the long pauses where she didn't know what to say, and then the quiet final sentence. "Okay, I understand." When she hung up, she placed the phone on the table as if it were fragile. She didn't slam it. She didn't drop it. She set it down gently, and somehow that hurt more than if she'd thrown it. Her eyes filled without sound, tears slipping down one by one like she was ashamed of them. I stepped closer, but she moved back, wiping her face quickly, embarrassed to let me see her hurting. In that moment, I wasn't looking at my daughter. I was looking at a version of myself I thought I'd buried long ago, the child who stood quietly while everyone else decided his worth for him. The child who learned to swallow disappointment like medicine. And as she looked at the table, she had set the candles, she had placed the food she had made, I felt something inside me shift in a way I couldn't undo. They didn't just reject the dinner. They rejected her. And watching it happen felt like watching my own childhood play out all over again, only this time I was old enough to understand the cost. After Lyra went to her room, I stayed in the living room, unable to move for several minutes. I needed a moment to gather myself to keep my anger from spilling out and filling the house. Every time I'd gotten upset growing up, my family had called me dramatic or overly sensitive. Standing there now, I felt the weight of all those old accusations pressing on my ribs. I went into the kitchen to start clearing the counters when my phone buzzed again, a bank alert. My stomach tightened as I opened it. A charge of $1,380 at Lakeview Harbor Grill, paid with my card, the same card my parents had access to from years ago, when they always had an excuse to borrow it. I stared at the screen, stunned. It wasn't just the betrayal of the dinner. They used my card to pay for the meal that replaced my daughter's work. They made me pay for their cruelty. I called my father. Clifford answered cheerfully like nothing was wrong. When I confronted him, he said, "We're family. Using your card shouldn't be a problem." His tone was calm, almost pleasant, which somehow made it even worse. I held myself together, even though my hands were shaking. A message from Selena arrived a minute later. "Don't make this bigger than it is. It's just one dinner. Lyra will forget." That sentence burned. I had heard versions of it my entire life. Forget. Drop it. Move on. Be quiet. Let it go. Always for their comfort, never mine. I went looking for Lyra and found her in the kitchen, standing in front of the 3-tier cake she'd made. The candles were ready. The writing was perfect. And she looked at it like it was something that had betrayed her. "Maybe we should throw it all out," she whispered. Hearing that hit me harder than the dinner, harder than the money, harder than any insult my family had thrown at me all these years. She started mumbling that maybe her food wasn't good enough, maybe nobody wanted it anyway, maybe they had done her a favor. Those words didn't come from her. They were planted in her by years of being dismissed, overlooked, and belittled. I couldn't let that continue. Not with her. Not again. I put a hand on her shoulder and said, "If they won't eat it, someone else will." She looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to believe me. That was enough to push me into motion. I stepped away, grabbed my phone, and opened my contacts. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call my sister. I called people who had shown us kindness over the years. Friends, neighbors, a couple of co-workers, people from the community who understood what effort meant. One by one they answered. One by one they said they would come. As I set the phone down, I looked back at Lyra still frozen in front of the cake, and I made myself a promise I would not let my family teach her that her work, her talent, or her heart were worthless. Not now, not ever. I will not let them teach her that her effort means nothing. Not again. I started calling everyone I could think of, neighbors, co-workers, old classmates, families from the volunteer group. One after another, people answered with the same words, "I'll be there." Every yes felt like a small piece of oxygen returning to a house that had been suffocating all evening. Lyra panicked at first, afraid people would come out of pity, but I held her shoulders and said, "This isn't pity. This is recognition. People see you, Lyra. Let them." She didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes didn't disappear right away. A close friend texted me saying he'd overheard someone at work mention my parents had reserved a table at Lakeview a week ago. Hearing that confirmed what the last 3 days had hinted at. They never planned to come. They let Lyra work herself past exhaustion just to ignore her in the end. The truth settled in my chest with a weight that was both painful and strangely clarifying. Cars began pulling into the driveway. Front lights flickered on across the neighborhood. People came carrying bottles of wine flowers, empty plates ready to be filled. Lyra hid in the kitchen, terrified they'd judge her food or see how shaken she really was. I stood outside for a moment, watching people step onto our lawn, and felt pride tightening in my throat. I had never seen a crowd show up for me like this, not as a child, not as an adult. Yet here they were, ready to show up for her. Then an unexpected knock sounded at the back door. A tall man with a camera bag stood there, introducing himself as Jasper Reed from the Chicago Food Chronicle. He said he'd heard about what happened through a friend of a friend and wanted to see the food for himself. I asked Lyra if she was okay with that. Her hands trembled, but she nodded. Jasper moved through the kitchen, asking thoughtful questions, taking photos, scribbling notes with an intensity that made the room feel suddenly important. And in Lyra's eyes, something flickered: fear, yes, but also hope. Real hope. As the main course went out, people began murmuring to each other. Then someone clapped. Then another. And suddenly the entire room stood to applaud her. The sound filled the house, loud, warm, genuine. I stood near the doorway, absorbing a moment I had dreamed of as a kid but had never received. Lyra, my daughter, had created something that earned recognition without needing anyone's permission. Throughout the night, I overheard bits of conversation. Some guests mentioned they'd always felt my parents treated me unfairly growing up. Others said they weren't surprised by what had happened. Hearing that from people who had known us for years made me realize I had not been imagining my childhood. It had been real, and it had left marks that were still healing. Someone showed me a photo my mother posted at the restaurant, laughing with a wine glass, surrounded by the same family members who told us tonight was adults only. Those at the party saw it too, and their anger on Lyra's behalf only grew. Somehow the truth felt even clearer. Blood ties didn't guarantee love, and tonight proved it. I looked around the room at the plates scraped clean, at the proud smiles, at my daughter quietly wiping her hands on her apron, and felt an unexpected calm settle inside me. That night, under the soft yellow lights of our backyard, I understood something I had never fully allowed myself to believe. Sometimes the people who recognize your value aren't the ones who share your last name. Sometimes they're the ones who simply choose to see you. After the guests left, the house was quiet in the kind of way that made me feel strangely peaceful. Lyra fell asleep on the sofa in her apron, small traces of frosting still on her sleeves. I was cleaning the counters when my phone vibrated with a message from Jasper. He sent the draft of his article, letting me know it would be published within hours. I read it carefully. He wrote everything exactly as it happened, how Lyra cooked alone for 3 days, how my family skipped the dinner without warning, how they paid for their restaurant meal using my card. For a moment I wondered if I should ask him to soften it. But when I looked at Lyra sleeping, the decision made itself. The truth was the truth. The article went live shortly after. Within hours it spread faster than I could refresh my notifications. People shared Lyra's photos, praised her dishes, criticized my family's behavior. By the time I drifted off to sleep in the armchair, she was already becoming known online as the teen chef who turned heartbreak into a feast. Then, sometime after midnight, pounding shook the door. I jolted awake and looked out the window. My parents and Selena were standing in the yard, shadows thrown from the porch light. They didn't wait to be invited in. They stormed inside the moment the door opened. "What have you done?" my father shouted. "You embarrassed us. The whole town is talking." My mother's voice cracked as she said I needed to correct the story. Selena demanded I explain myself, insisting that Lyra was dramatic, that the article exaggerated everything. And then came the sentence that cut through the room like ice: "That girl should be ashamed for making us look bad." Before I could react, Lyra, half awake, frightened, stepped behind me and heard every word. I stepped forward, blocking their view of her. "No," I said. "You don't get to call my daughter a liar. Not anymore." It was the first time I had ever spoken to my mother without shrinking. Selena then tried to demand my credit card, saying they were dealing with backlash and needed it temporarily. Decades of financial manipulation condensed into one entitled request. But something in me had changed. "The card is locked, and you're not using my accounts ever again," I said. They stared at me in disbelief, as if defiance from me was unnatural. My father moved closer, his face inches from mine. "You've always been the useless one." It was the same sentence that haunted my childhood, the one that shaped the version of me they expected me to be. But this time the words slid off me. I looked him in the eye and answered, "Maybe in this family, but not to my daughter, and not to the people who showed up tonight." Just then, Jeff from across the street stepped into the doorway holding his phone. "You might want to know the live stream has over 6,000 people watching," he said. My parents froze. The town, the same people they cared so deeply about impressing, was watching everything unravel. My mother tugged at my father's arm, trying to pull him toward the door. He refused, shouting that I was betraying the family. But I pointed at the exit and said, "Family isn't a place where one person pays for everyone else's cruelty." The room went silent. Then I felt Lyra slip her hand into mine. She stepped beside me and whispered, "Dad, enough." It was small, quiet, but it steadied every part of me. It told me exactly where the line was. I told them to leave my home. My father tried to argue, but Jamie appeared at the doorway, standing behind me like a wall. Faced with 2 grown men no longer bending to them, my family finally backed away. Outside, neighbors gathered, whispering, watching. The door shut behind my parents with a hollow thud that echoed through the house. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of decades lift off my shoulders. The relationship was broken, maybe beyond repair. But something in me, something that had been bruised for years, finally felt free. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, the house felt heavier and lighter at the same time, like the air had been punched out of the walls, but somehow replaced with something cleaner. I stood there with Lyra's hand still in mine, feeling the pulse in her fingertips, realizing how close I had come to letting history repeat itself. Not just repeating the pattern of silence, but handing it to her the way it had been handed to me. And the only thing standing between that past and her future was the moment she whispered, "Dad, enough." After everything we'd just lived through, the lies, the dismissal, the dinner they'd stolen from her, the accusation that she should feel ashamed hearing those words from her, felt like someone had struck a match inside the dark rooms I'd kept locked for years. I never had the courage to say it for myself. But she did. And because she did, I finally could. That night, after Lyra went back to sleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of her cooking, the citrus peels on the counter, the empty pans cooling near the sink, the lingering sweetness of her cake drifting through the house. I thought about how close she had come to believing that none of it mattered. How close I had come to believing that this was just another wound we'd learned to carry quietly. But silence had never protected me. It had only taught me how to make myself small. Maybe that's why the applause earlier that night meant more than I could say, not because a room full of people praised the food, but because Lyra finally felt something I had spent my entire life waiting for: acknowledgement without conditions. She had earned it with her own hands, her own fire, her own stubborn determination. And watching her receive it made something inside me unlock. When the article blew up online, messages poured in from strangers across the state, parents who said they'd been dismissed by their own families, adults who said they'd never been valued for their passions, teenagers who said Lyra inspired them to keep creating even when people around them didn't care. I read every message, slowly letting the weight of them settle in. It was strange to think thousands of people felt connected to a story born out of heartbreak in our backyard. And yet every word they sent made me even more certain we had done the right thing. There's something I realized as I watched the sun rise that morning. It's easy to believe blood obligates us, that loyalty must come from lineage. For years, I kept trying to earn something that should have been given freely. Love, respect, encouragement, none of those things should have been negotiable. But my family treated them like currency I had to buy with obedience. And for a long time, I paid that price. I thought everyone paid it. I thought that was normal. It wasn't. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt still, but it was the kind of quiet that brought clarity instead of fear. Lyra was already writing down the recipe for the duck glaze, humming softly to herself. She wasn't defeated. She wasn't broken. She wasn't shrinking to fit anyone's expectations. She was moving forward, already thinking about the next dish, the next dinner, the next chance to grow. And it struck me that the resilience she showed wasn't something she inherited from my side of the family. It was something she built in spite of it. Emails came in later from culinary programs she had bookmarked on her laptop. They'd seen the article. They wanted to meet her. One restaurant in Chicago invited her to spend a week in their kitchen over the summer. She stared at the screen with disbelief, her hands covering her mouth. Watching her cry for a reason that didn't break her, watching joy push out fear, felt like witnessing a second sunrise. Meanwhile, my family sent one last message demanding I correct the narrative or they'd seek legal action. I deleted their email, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilt. I felt steady. I felt like a father who finally chose the right side. Later that evening, Lyra asked me if we had done the right thing, if standing up to them, exposing what happened, refusing to bend had been the right path. I sat next to her on the dock and told her the truth. I don't know what's right for them, but I know protecting you is right for me. And that's enough. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt a sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because the next chapter for the two of us didn't depend on the approval of people who had never truly seen us. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes you don't lose a family. You simply step out of the shadows of people who never acted like one in the first place. And sometimes the family you build by choice, the ones who show up when your heart is on the table, are the people who give you the courage to stop carrying the pain that was never yours to hold. If you're still here with me, thank you. Sharing something like this isn't easy, but knowing someone out there is listening makes the weight a little less heavy. If you want to tell me where you're watching from, or even just say, "Hi, I'd love to hear from you." Stories like mine reach farther than we ever expect, and sometimes the smallest comment reminds someone they're not alone. And if you'd like to hear more stories, ones about resilience, about choosing better paths, about finding light in places you never thought to look, feel free to subscribe. Your support means more than you know. My name is Rhett Hale, and this is the story of how I realized that choosing my daughter wasn't just the right choice, it was the only one I'd ever choose again.